For those of you baseball fans, and there might be a few baseball fans out there, Ernie Banks, who was the ebullient shortstop and first baseman for the Chicago Cubs when I was a kid, is reported to have, on a particularly beautiful day, playing baseball. He says, "It's such a beautiful day, let's play two." So here we are with the second half of the doubleheader, with some terrific speakers, both again folks who were participants and in the room when it happened, and those who had more of an arm's length view of my dad's remarkable career. And we're going to start off with, I think, what has already been recognized as one of my dad's first and most significant tests in his leadership as governor, and that is managing through the crisis at 3 Mile Island. Looking around the room, there are a lot of folks, I think Pennsylvanians, who were around in March of 1979. You probably remember something of where you were and how you felt and what you heard about that very challenging time. I know I do. And I think it's already been noted that this was an incredible test that my dad and his team took on and succeeded. So that's a good place to begin in our second half of our doubleheader. Just again, as a little bit of context, this is early in my dad's first term as governor. He's 46 years old, 72 days into the first term. As far as he was concerned, the job in front of him was to finish confirming his cabinet, to put together a budget for this first critical year, turning the promises of the campaign into policy and budget proposals. And then the phone rang at 7:50 on March 28, 1979. This is in keeping with Andy Carr's notion that a lot of his career was taking the call of hearing the invitation and responding to the occasion. So joining me to talk about that incident and its aftermath and how my dad and his team managed their way through that is John Baer, the longtime columnist. At the time was a columnist in Harrisburg. At the time was with WITF, the public station in Harrisburg. And there are few people, honestly, John, who I think know the warp and woof of Pennsylvania politics more than you do. And we're literally there at the scene, March 28th, 1979. So let's start with the question I just sort of semi-rhetorically asked to everybody in the room. Where were you? Tell us something about your own circumstances, your family, particularly in those first early, chaotic, anxious hours after the accident was reported.
I will. First, I have to mention Ginny Thornburgh asked me to be gentle. I can tell you after 32 years with the Philadelphia Daily News and the Philadelphia Inquirer, that is not my nature. But back then, I had started my career at the Harrisburg Patriot News as a print journalist, went to Washington for a year on a congressional fellowship, came back, went to work for public broadcasting, and your dad was elected governor. We were interested in both that process, so we made a statewide documentary called Transition, a Governor Takes Office, which was brilliant on my part because I got to meet him, his entire senior staff, so even before they took office, I had contacts within the administration. Same happened for 3 Mile Island. It was a presence in the Harrisburg area for years prior. Those of us who were reporting for the Harrisburg paper at the time often questioned that presence, given that it was right beside an airport. Why build a nuclear facility next to an airport? Didn't seem like great planning. So we wrote about that. We wrote about the environmental objections to the plant. So I had some knowledge of both the nuclear industry, 3 Mile Island, and the new governor. When, on the day the accident happened, a Wednesday, I think I was driving into work and heard on the radio that something had happened Nobody knew what it was. All of the initial reports were, everything's fine, nothing to worry about, just a little blip. So you kind of settle in for your day. A little bit later in the day, the lieutenant governor, who was then assigned in charge of energy or emergencies or some such thing, came out, made a statement, and said, nothing's wrong, nothing to worry about, no harm to the public. Unbeknownst to everybody, except the operators of 3 Mile Island, radioactive steam had been released into the atmosphere without anyone knowing about it, without any authorization, and things were a little bit worse than anybody thought. So it felt, again, to the lieutenant governor later in the day to come out with a press conference and say something semi-harmless like, things are a little bit more complex than we initially were told, right? So you start to think, oh. So we settled in with learning everything we could about that plant, its structure, what could go wrong. One of the frightening things in the good book is the governor, the first night, pulls down what he said was an unread book, and as he says in the book, reassuringly titled, "The Day We Lost Detroit," which was about a problem at the Enrico Fermi plant in Michigan in which the word meltdown comes up. So I imagine his evening was a little uneasy as we go into another day of conflicting information, unbelievable non-responses to questions from what became a gathering storm of national and ultimately international press. So by day 2, Thursday, we didn't have a lot more information than we did, but the lieutenant governor was sort of pushed back, and the governor came out to address people's concerns, hopefully cause calm. Any journalist knows that's not a good sign in terms of what's going on, right? If there was not a problem, somebody else would be handling it. So the nature of the information, even on the second day, ranged between some chatter about evacuating the area and the NRC saying, it's really, we don't think there's anything wrong. And that's how kind of the first 2 days went. I think it was on the second day that we, working with PBS, in fact, I interviewed your dad in the evening of, I think, the second day.
This would have been Friday.
No, this would have been, I think, Thursday.
Okay.
I think. We had WITF studios at that time. We were in downtown Hershey, the happiest town on the planet. And he came in, and we had another guest who was an environmentalist, and myself, and PBS took us live, and we had more questions than answers. I thought it went okay. Paul Critchlow, the governor's press secretary, did not. When I got off the set, I was told there's a phone call for you, and Critchlow is screaming at me because either I or the environmentalist had raised some very troubling questions that the governor, of course, at that point, couldn't answer because we didn't have the information. Why would you put him in that situation? Why would you do that to him? I'm basically, Paul, look, we're trying to just get as much information as we can. But I took a pretty good tongue lashing that evening.
There's a lot to unpack there.
You said talk fast.
My dad used the term the garble gap to describe the chaotic nature of communications flying around.
Yeah.
I also point out if you want to get a better feel for this, if you weren't there, on the archive site at the university, at the Dick Thornburgh Forum, there's footage from some of those early press conferences, which I think reveal the sense of anxiety and uncertainty and what's going on and so forth. But being a good reporter, how did you try to sort out fact from fiction, from rumor, from innuendo, from wishful thinking, particularly in those early days? And I'll point out, this is the peculiar thing about this type of disaster. It's not a flood. It's not a hurricane. You can't feel the wind. You can't see the water. You just know there's something out there that could be deadly.
Well, the broader context is no governor in the history of the country had ever had to face anything quite like this, ever, prior to this. And remember the age. I mean, we're in 1979, so the nature of communication isn't exactly what it is today. So because I had worked on environmental issues affecting the plant, I had contacts in the Department of Environmental Resources. It took days to even get to them because they were, of course, buried with their own problems trying to figure out what was going on. It was almost impossible to get reliable information from anybody. It became very clear that the corporation, that the plant operators were not being completely open with us in a hurry. And one of the high ironies of the timing was the movie China Syndrome had just started playing in the Harrisburg area. And there's a line of dialogue in the movie where they're talking about the impact of a meltdown. And the line is, it could contaminate an area the size of Pennsylvania. So people are seeing this, hearing about this, reading this, and they don't know if they're going to be leaving the area or for how long or if they're ever coming back. So we keep going back and forth about evacuation, not evacuation. Information was very, very thin, and we just basically did what we could.
You and I talked about, in a sort of a semi-rhetorical question, if that happened today, given Twitter and cell phones and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, would we be better off or worse off? And maybe we'll leave that alone, but do you have a quick answer?
I do have a quick answer. I think it would be better for the people trying to manage it because you would have gotten instant contact. It would be worse for society because you can imagine what social media would do with a situation where nobody knows anything.
Yeah.
I mean, it would have been good and bad.
Yeah. Part of the story as recounted here is the frustration that my dad and his folks had in getting busy signals from folks like the NRC or others where they needed some reliable information. So to that point, if you had the secure cell phone number, it might have been better off.
Right.
You mentioned to me when we were talking about this, the decision you and your family were facing, which I think puts sort of in microcosm what a lot of folks were going through. Would you mind just sort of telling that story?
First of all, I felt my family has like a karmic relationship to Governor Thornburgh for two reasons. My older son is an assistant U.S. attorney here in Pennsylvania. My younger son was born on the day Dick Thornburgh was elected governor. So in March of 1979, I had a 4-month-old and a 4-year-old. On Friday, when in downtown Harrisburg, someone tripped an emergency alarm and sirens are blowing throughout the city, and the governor on Friday advised pregnant women and preschool children in an abundance of safety should leave the area. So with a 4-month-old and a 4-year-old, there was no decision. My wife is a master's prepared Georgetown nurse. Anything having to do with health and my sons, there isn't going to be an argument. So I felt a little uneasy about leaving. As a journalist, I felt a little bit uneasy. As a father, I had no qualms. So we loaded the car. We stopped at the bank. I took out everything I had, which was probably like $400, because you literally didn't know if you would ever come back.
Yeah.
Because by that time, people were talking about China Syndrome, meltdown, an area the size of Pennsylvania being contaminated. Yeah. So it was alternately frightening and just a lot of anxiety, both personally and professionally.
You mentioned, I think maybe day 2 or a little after, that there was a press event where my dad's maybe moved to the fore.
Yeah.
And that sent a signal that this is serious now. I'm curious, from that day and over the next couple days, what your observation about how they adapted, how they learned to maybe straighten out channels of communication, get kind of their cadence of of how they were going to deal with you folks, communicate with the public. What did you see in those first few days?
Well, in the book, your dad makes it very clear that it didn't take long before he finally just said to the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, "Get me somebody." And that somebody, of course, was Harold Denton, who came and took on the mantle of flying-in superhero because he spoke plainly, he explained what was going on, he seemed to have full control of the situation. And Governor Thornburgh's presence throughout, just his nature, just the way he presented himself, the way he talked, the way he talked about the process, and just the tone of his voice was enough to have a little bit of a damping down. People still were scared. I mean, don't get me wrong, but it at least seemed like something was being done. While the company was clearly unsure about it, what exactly it was, both the governor and Harold Denton gave, I think, the public a sense that we got this.
So that sense of, is an interesting sort of an X factor, how you communicate in a way that reassures people, that gives them confidence, even if in the back of your mind,
You have no idea.
you have no idea.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing, and it takes a unique person to pull that off, and I think he did.
Yeah. And you mentioned it was both his instinct that I need somebody,
Right.
call the president, and then fortuitously, Harold Denton, who I think he acknowledges and all acknowledge, and who sadly died a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
was really the critical figure in kind of creating that sense of confidence. So you mentioned the decision point kind of crystallized as evacuate, don't evacuate.
Right.
And I suspect there was, by the way, I was in California at the time when the going gets tough, which was actually really bizarre because I wasn't close enough to, you know, I was talking to my mom, I remember talking to you, but these were anxious times, but I was 3,000 miles away. But that was the decision that was bandied back and forth, evacuate, don't evacuate. And which way was the conventional wisdom headed as far as you with your repertorial instincts could tell? What would people think like, here's what you got to do, Governor?
You mean here's what the governor has to do?
Yes. I mean, this decision about evacuation, how was
Well, I mean,
that
I think
playing
that
out?
that decision seemed at the time both reasonable and safe. Because if you said everybody out, you can't imagine the chaos that would be created, even in, I guess, at that time, there's maybe 500,000 people within 10 miles of the plant, which was what they were considering the critical area. It would just been total chaos. And, but the decision that he made regarding pregnant women and preschool children seemed both safe and reasonable.
Yeah.
And I think that in itself added some calm.
Yeah.
I know many, many people who did not leave, who had no children, and who just felt that it sounded like the thing was on a downslide now, that it was going to be okay, even though it so far wasn't.
That strikes me, you know, there's a seasonality to disasters, and this question of evacuation often comes up, and it always seems to me like what's underestimated is the cost of evacuation.
Yeah.
The disruption, people in hospitals or long-term care facilities, people with disabilities, that like you can't just pack up and move, and then by the way, everybody heads to the same road, and all of a sudden you've got miles-long traffic jams, which reminds me the story of the evacuation plans in the Harvey Taylor Bridge, which is told in here. You remember that one?
Yes.
Yeah. So basically, and this is Cumberland County and Dauphin County, right, that had, when we started looking at the evacuation plans, it realized that both of them had people headed over the Harvey Taylor Bridge, but in opposite directions. So imagine.
That'd work out well.
Yeah, that would work out well. That would be a story to cover.
Yeah. Let's not do that.
You mentioned when we were talking that this incident revealed a lot about the story is best told as the people of 3 Mile Island.
Yeah.
Both, obviously, the first-person stories, what's this mean, but also who did this bring to the fore that deserves our recognition?
Well, I mean, I think the fact, I mean, your dad talks about an adhocracy and the importance of, in a crisis, getting a group of people around you that you know and trust and are smart. He had that. He was very fortunate. His staff was maybe the best, his and Tom Ridge's are maybe the best gubernatorial staffs that I've covered, and I go back to Shap. And when you have good people around you, governing becomes a little bit easier, and he did. He was fortunate. There is, and you can tell this because to find out how good a politician is, get to know his staff, see if they stay with him, see what they say about him, what they think about him, and you'll get to know the governor, even if you don't know him personally. That was the case in this case, and Governor Thornburgh did very well in that. And also, over time, does that change at all? In this case, it did not. And finally, that really did set the tone for his gubernatorial legacy. I mean, it absolutely did. People had faith in him. People knew he was competent. People knew he was smart. And that set the table. And if you don't think that legacy still lives, I'd refer you to last Sunday's Philadelphia Inquirer, very long endorsement of Josh Shapiro as the next governor. The endorsement also excoriates the Republican nominee and the party that nominated him and asks the question. This isn't 1979, this is 2022. It asks the question, where's the next Dick Thornburgh?
John, we could talk about this for hours. There's so much here, but I feel like we want to move on to some other chapters, but I can't resist, maybe you spurred me with that. One further question. One of the lessons he says, he outlines 10 lessons, which is a little too much for, we're not going to go through all of them, but one of them was forget partisanship in it. And sadly, it feels like that's a lesson we're not heeding these days, he says, mildly. Did you see any semblance of partisanship in the way
not a shred at that time.
Yeah.
And now that's all I see.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll come back to that or some others, but thank you, John, for your remarks. So we're going to move on from what I'll think of as a crisis to an opportunity that was revealed and encouraged when Dad was Attorney General. And that was, and Andy Card again mentioned this in passing, his support for, advocacy for, and his leadership in passing the Americans with Disability Act, which I think he really felt was, if not the last frontier, an important frontier and milestone in civil rights and securing the civil rights for millions of Americans. We're privileged today to be joined by John Wodetch, who is a career disability rights attorney, was literally in the room with my dad in working on the legislation that became the Americans with Disability Act, was worked on its passage, and then spent much of the rest of his career in implementing that around the country and even around the world. Before we get to that story, just give us some of the backstory. How did we get to the point where this issue kind of appeared in what I'll call this window of opportunity? What had gone on in the last decade? What brought it to the point where it says we can now turn this into a piece of legislation and pursue it?
There are a couple of things that are important in the 80s leading up to this. One of the most important things is what a nominee for president says during a campaign, because Vice President Bush was running for office. He wanted to disassociate himself a little bit from the Reagan administration, establish himself as his own person. He also had a history of dealing with disability issues President Reagan had appointed him to be head of the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Relief, which was looking at 504, the Education with Disabilities Education Act, whether they should be terminated. And so Vice President Bush spent a lot of time negotiating with the Department of Justice, with the disability community. So there was knowledge of the people, knowledge of those issues. And in 1988, when he was running for president, he said, if I'm elected, I'm going to pass a comprehensive law protecting the rights of people with disabilities. That was one important thing. The HIV epidemic had been occurring, and the Reagan administration had a study. Admiral Watkins issued a report. It had 498 recommendations. It was a huge report, but it had 10 chief recommendations, and one of them was we should have a civil rights law that protects people who are HIV positive so that they will feel comfortable to come forward and be treated, otherwise they're going to spread the disease. So those things were coming together. At the same time, there were Democrats, together with Lowell Weicker, who was a Republican senator from Connecticut, working on a bill, and it was an idea bill. It was viewed by a lot of people as the Flat Earth Society bill. Everything that a person with a disability would ever want was in this bill. They had a public hearing, and so that was out there. The ideas were out there.
Interesting. That first point is worth underlining. You know, we've become conditioned to the fact that, you know, when you run for office, you say something and it doesn't matter, then you do whatever you want. When in fact, that's not the case.
That's not the case.
Even today.
Yeah.
So once this came into focus and that window of opportunity had opened, you're now, give us a sense of where you were in the Department of Justice, how you started working with my dad.
I was in the Civil Rights Division. The Ted Kennedy and Tom Harkin, two Democratic senators, were working with the disability community. They went to them, I know, and said to them, we want to move forward with this. We can't move forward with the bill we had. What compromises can you make to make this reasonable? So they were working with them. At the same time, they came to the White House and said, we're interested in this bill. We noticed that you were in favor of a bill. We want to talk to you. And the president turned to the Attorney General and said, I want you to be the point person on this. And said to him, I want a bill. Put the onus on him to do something about it. I was in the Civil Rights Division doing disability rights. So it was the beginning of a new administration. He did not have political appointees for the Civil Rights Division yet. It always takes a while in any administration for those nominees to come through. There were some people the White House had put in, minders, you might call them, who were probably a little more conservative than the president was on this issue. And so Attorney General Thornburgh was, okay, I have to produce. And so we reached out to Kennedy and Harkin and began a conversation about what might be, how we might proceed from there. And
what, focusing on this assignment that my dad embraced, was given but embraced, the invitation. Talk about how he managed and led through that process. What role did he play? How did he work with you? How did he manage some of the
First of all, he was the right
politics?
person. He had been governor of a state. He understood what this might mean for a state. He was the father of a person with a disability, so he had his own personal experiences and knew what the life of a person with a disability was and what it meant for their family. He happened to be married to one of the leading disability rights advocates in the country. And he has his own approach to the law. He was a calm, reasoned, he applied the law. Now this was policy, but you looked at policy, and so he came up, together we came up with how are we going to approach this? And he had two basic ideas, and I would call them, how are you going to sell this idea? Social change is very hard. Social change of the nature of this, where we are going to change how our American society deals in a number of ways. So his instincts for commitment to principle, but compromising to achieve that principle were very important in how we approach this. And so he looked at the existing law, which was Section 504, because the issues that we were confronting is, what is a person with a disability? Not always the easiest thing to know. What is discrimination? And how do you deal with cost? Which was very much a concern with any of the concepts that were being discussed. And so we came up with two ideas. One was comprehensiveness. The idea was to sell this law was we are going to give to people with disabilities the same federal civil rights that other people have, African Americans have, women have. So it was a very conservative idea. We are just giving one segment of the population things that we give to other people. The next idea was, all right, and I call it incrementalism, which was, we'll look at 504. 504 has a definition of disability. It has what is discrimination. It had limitations. You didn't have to do something if it was an undue burden. You didn't have to do something if it fundamentally altered your program. In the Reagan administration, there were roughly, this is how I spent the 80s, about 100 504 regulations that were issued in the federal government. So the federal agencies, including, were used to dealing with those issues. So he used both of those ideas as the basis for how to sell this.
Yeah. Having said that, having heard that, my guess is there are no, this was not a short, straight, and narrow path politically.
No.
So give us some sense of the twists and the turns.
Well,
Was there ever a point where you thought, we just can't do this, we can't pull this off?
It was, talk about strange bedfellows. The people who were interested in this were Ted Kennedy, Tom Harkin, and President Bush. Everyone else in the White House was like, why are we with those people? Well, except for Boyden Gray, who was the president's legal counsel, and was someone who we had negotiated with through the 80s. And so there was another person, Evan Kemp, who was a Republican disability rights advocate, was being nominated to be head of the EEOC. And so there were some support, but the idea that we were doing this was very odd to many people in the administration, and including if I would call him that, the president's minder, who was at Justice, was someone who was not in support of any of these things. And so it took a while for the Attorney General to work with other parts of the administration, but he had the support of the President, he had the support of the President's legal counsel, which, when it came down to it, people who were uncomfortable with it weren't coming forward because they knew the President wanted it. They had put out a book of the President's promises, and we must meet these. There was a whole document. And so Dick Thornburgh was taking what the President told him and running with it. But it was not a smooth course, especially when the issues were covering public accommodations, which are all private businesses in the United States, saying they have to make their programs accessible, saying they have to have sign language interpreters or materials in Braille. These were costly issues.
Yeah, but as you said, if you had to, if you were being dealt a hand of cards, those are three pretty good cards.
They were pretty good cards. And the big point was going to be, he was the point person. He was going to testify before the Senate committee that had jurisdiction. That was where the administration's position was going to be put forth. And so his activity was, what am I going to say? What can I say? Right, and that's how we approached like a 2-month period of adopting positions and then writing testimony that, if those of you who work in the federal government, it goes to all the agencies, they comment on it. You have negotiations. Coming up with what he is going to say becomes very important. And it was very important to him as well as a person. I think
this is when you and I talked a little while ago, this is the testimony we was referring to. There was some back and forth.
One of my favorite moments, one of my favorite Dick Thornburgh moments, it was the night before he was going to testify. We were in his office. We're going over the testimony, looking at it, looking at the comments, and the phone rings, and it's the Office of Management and Budget on the line. And so we're sitting there listening to Dick Thornburgh talking to them, and he's going, yeah, I can do that, and we can change that word. And then it's quiet for a while, and he's going, I'm not sure, what is that again? And he finally says, in an amazing moment for me to witness, if you want someone to say that, you are going to have to get someone else to testify. He was, in effect, putting his job on the line for this principle. It was an amazing moment. So we're sitting there.
What was the other end of the conversation?
Well, we were sitting there like terrified at this point because we were very fond of, he was a wonderful leader, a wonderful person, and this was a very personal issue to him as well as an important issue for the country, and OMB backed down. And I think he knew he was, and so he went forward and testified, and I know not too long ago, we did a project on the ADA, and a couple disability rights leaders testified and have written that they knew at that moment that there was going to be an ADA. Because the positive nature, and he didn't say we're endorsing the bill, he said we are endorsing the idea that we will have legislation. There are a lot of things in your bill, they had a bill, that we don't like, but I know we can come to terms if we negotiate. So that was the starting point for the real negotiations.
Yeah. So can we fast forward to the signing and then the early days?
The signing was a wonderful moment. We all loved it. However, that meant under the law we had 1 year to write 2 regulations, to write 2 technical assistance manuals, to write the standards for what is accessible buildings in the United States, and to write a technical assistance plan with contracts and grants.
Yeah.
And the Attorney General said to me, you're in charge, you are going to do this, and we are going to meet all of these deadlines. But he also said, you will have the resources to do it. We will make, and he actually created the Office on the Americans with Disabilities Act, which sounded wonderful to the public. It was really me and my secretary.
Yeah.
When we started, but we did have the resources to do this. And we spent the next year having public hearings, writing regulations, raising issues. It was a very detailed, and there were a number of wonderful people on our team working on this issue.
Parenthetically, where was
issues.
public opinion on this? I mean, may not have been a front and center
No,
issue,
it had gone through Congress with five separate congressional committees, 6, 5 in the House, 1 in the Senate. There had been amendments, there had been attempts to defeat it. It had been in the news. There had been protests at Congress when they were dragging their feet. I think a lot of people may remember that what's called the Congressional Crawl, series of people in wheelchairs who got out of their wheelchairs and climbed up the Capitol steps to demonstrate, to get Congress to act. So it was very much in the public eye, and I think there was support. There was general support for the ideas of it. No one really understood it. Although I'll tell you, one of my favorite calls I got was the day after the law passed. We then had a hotline people could call. And we got a call from North Carolina from a hotel owner. And he said, what have you people in Washington done? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, a wheelchair user came into my hotel and said, you passed a law that entitled me to the best room in the hotel at the cheapest rate. And I said, what did you do? Well, I gave him the best room at the cheapest rate. So we knew we had a lot of job to do about letting people know what the bill said, because it was a very complicated bill. Every right had some limitation to deal with cost issues. But it was very much, I think it was in the public eye, and there was support for it.
So now fast forward over the decades, as you look at really the bulk of your career dedicated to this piece of legislation, the ultimate question is, what difference does it make?
It may, in my view, of course, I have been accused of being a Pollyanna, so keep that in mind. I think it's made an immense difference in our society. I think if you look around us, the changes are everywhere. in our buildings, the fact that every bus system in this country is fully accessible. It took 20 years to do it, but transportation systems, buildings, building design. The Olympics that we held in Atlanta changed how we look at building design for both the athletes, making sure that, we made sure that the Atlanta baseball stadium that had a ramp from the dugout to the field, because it was required by the ADA that the stadiums would have accessible seating. There are huge changes that happened in those areas. Integration of people with disabilities, not just in education, but out of institutions, especially for people with severe disabilities and intellectual disabilities, the idea that they can live independent lives with the right supports, are all ideas that were developed and continue to be developed. But I think the most important change is really attitudes and awareness. The role that people with disabilities could see themselves as having productive lives. Oh, and of course I didn't mention employment. We're not talking about employment very much, but the idea that people with disabilities can be employed, can go to college. The percentage of people with disabilities in American universities now is 12%. When we started, it was below 1.1%. I mean, there are immense changes, but the real changes, I think, are people with disabilities knowing that they have opportunities. There's something called the ADA generation. It's a generation of people who are now coming to adulthood, who for their whole lives have had opportunities that they think they are entitled to. The other side of that, I think, is a lot of discrimination against people with disabilities comes from fear of the other. I mean, we had cases where people thought they didn't want to hire a woman who had breast cancer because they could catch it. The fear of that. And I think those fears and stereotypes will disappear the more people with disabilities and people without disabilities work, live, and play together. And that is happening. It's a long process. There are still many things for us to do: website accessibility, real employment opportunities. There are many accessible medical equipment. There are many issues for us still to tackle, but I think we have made immense changes, and we have introduced them to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is making these changes as well. Yeah. I think Attorney General Thornburgh's leadership, his commitment to this, his ability to compromise, to bring people who are on opposite sides of this, and each side gave up some major things and got some major things in what became the ADA, and I think that is the strength that he brought to it that has enabled the statute to live and be a living thing that will continue to grant opportunity for people with disabilities.
That sounds like a great note. Thank you, John.
Thanks.
And thank you for your great work. Sure.
I didn't.
Fundamentally, what it did is recognize us as people.
Yes.
Yep. Yep.
That is correct.
All other changes stem from that. That we are American citizens and we are people.
Yeah. Yeah. Good for you. Okay, now we're in the final frame.
Yes.
We now turn to another chapter in my dad's life where, in this case, he resumed a role that he had previously played before he became U.S. Attorney, which is as a useful citizen. Because of the work that he had done and the leadership roles that he'd had between the mid-'60s and the early '90s, that work was of a different nature and character. Perhaps gave him the opportunity to have more impact, and was, as again Andy Card had noted, incredibly diverse and consequential. It began when, after the Senate race in 1991, he took a call from the president's office who asked him to serve in the United Nations, which he did admirably for a year, did his best to describe ways, with the assistance of some wonderful folks in this room, how the United Nations could be put on more stable fiscal ground, and how it could, how we could restore our confidence in the United Nations as a global force. He served on countless civic boards and leadership roles at the Urban Institute. He created and then chaired for a long time something called the State Science and Technology Initiative, which carried out the lessons that we heard about from Ben Franklin. He was involved with the National Academy of Public Administration. Again, countless task forces, commissions, speeches, op-eds around issues as diverse as tort reform, sovereignty for Puerto Rico, election integrity. He took a number of trips sponsored by both the NGA and corollary organizations to monitor elections in other countries, Russia included, to weigh in on the transfer of power going on in Hong Kong, the prospects for online voting, and on and on. It's really an extraordinary, I think, time in his life and a continued life of service. He was, once again, returned to his dear law firm that meant so much to him, now by this time called K&L Gates, where he worked with Mike Missel, who we're going to talk with in a second, and others on a series of very consequential, high-impact projects, special assignments, we'll call them, that not only, I'll call them in character, and you can fine-tune this, Mike. I call them sometimes forensic. What happened? Who did what to whom? What went wrong? But we're also intended to try to realize reforms in some significant process so that this didn't happen again, which is maybe the harder part. But Mike, you and I talked about, and you were a partner at K&L Gates at the time, and were his wingman on some really significant assignments. By the way, the through line on, I think, a lot of people that work with Dad is that they were passionate baseball fans, as Mike is. So I heard...
I have one thing going for me.
That's right. He and Chuck Rosenberg were comparing Washington Nationals, where their season tickets were. So, you know, this is the secret story of you good folks. But, so, I don't know how many assignments you worked on with my dad, but talk about maybe the greatest hits, some of the most significant projects that you and he worked on.
Sure. Yeah, first of all, it's just a real pleasure and honor to be here and being here to honor such a great man. You know, as you point out, the law firm was really important to him. I think his tenure at the firm spanned over 50 years, from the time he started as an associate all the way, every time he was not serving the public, he was serving law firm clients. So we worked on dozens of matters together. Some of the more significant ones, one of the big ones was involving a company called WorldCom. So WorldCom was started by a gentleman named Bernie Ebbers, who was a high school basketball coach. And he started a small long-distance company, and it became a public company. And the revenues kept increasing. And he kept buying more and more companies because as the share price was going up, he had more and more money to spend on companies. And by 2000, he had the second largest telephone company in the United States. This thing was mammoth, and it's run by a former basketball coach with no business experience whatsoever. That's sort of a recipe for a problem. So they decided, okay, we got to keep growing. Our revenues have to keep increasing. They were going to do a merger with Sprint. And the Justice Department, ironically enough, said, no, we're not going to allow it. It would violate antitrust laws. So the Sprint merger didn't go through, which killed the stock price of WorldCom and really sent it down. So they have to do something to increase revenues. So they came up with an idea. Their biggest expense were the line costs. So as a long-distance company, you're renting line space from other companies out there. So what they did is they essentially just flipped the accounting switch. These line costs were expenses. They then called them capital assets. So all these expenses come off the books. All of a sudden, revenues start exploding again, stock price goes up. Fortunately, there were a few people within WorldCom who had ethics, who had honesty, also known as some whistleblowers, who came forward, and a criminal case was brought. They misstated revenues by $3.8 billion back when that was real money. And WorldCom quickly went into bankruptcy. It was the largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States at the time. So this is in 2002. So when a company goes into bankruptcy and there's allegations of fraud, and we had far more than allegations in this situation, the Department of Justice can appoint an examiner to look at the company and assist the bankruptcy judge in what to do with the bankruptcy estate. So they looked around. Who better to take a really hard look at it than Dick Thornburgh? So Dick was appointed as the examiner, and our job was to investigate and prepare reports for the bankruptcy court. So we could have done stuff on the accounting issue, but that was pretty simple and basic. There was just a clear outright fraud. But Dick wanted to go further, as Dick always wanted to do. Dick said, how could this happen? What kind of environment was at this company? So we started to look at the governance of the company. And this is the same time, this is following Enron and some other very high-profile failures. Congress was very interested as well. So they had passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act to improve corporate governance at company. And what we found at WorldCom really was the poster child for poor governance. At a company, you have a board of directors that's supposed to be conducting oversight and watching what was going on. This board of directors were Bernie Ebbers' good friends. They had most of their financial assets tied into the company, and Bernie had them. So he was able to get loans from the company, which he used to buy the biggest yacht in the world, a big ranch, and Bernie just wasn't paying much attention to the company. So we put out reports that really could serve as a playbook for good corporate governance. So we put in a whole lot of different things looking at the bad governance at WorldCom and what they should have done differently.
It's interesting you said, so you could have taken the sort of maybe the easy path to say, here's what happened, blah, 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 but this was all with the intent, as you said, of answering the question, how do we keep this from happening again? I have to insert one note of personal privilege in this. I remember talking about this. I was visiting my folks at dinner in Washington. We were talking about this, and I said, Dad, he was giving me the broad contours of the situation. I said, this is one of those where the checks didn't balance and the balances didn't check. He's like, I like that.
I think that made it into one of our reports.
It did. It was in the New York Times, except it was ascribed to a friend of his. So I called him to task on that, Dad. But since when are we just friends here? Anyway, so that's a great illustrative example of how you figured out what happened that cascades into a significant policy change, which has really kind of cast the environment for corporate governance. So talk through another one that might have had a similar.
So in 2004, as Andy well knows, the presidential election was between the sitting president, George W. Bush, and John Kerry. One of the issues in the campaign that John Kerry was trying to make was, I'm a war hero. I went to Vietnam. I'm a decorated veteran. President Bush didn't go to Vietnam. He went in the Texas Air National Guard with the assumption that he used political favors to get in to avoid Vietnam. It became a big campaign issue. A lot of people were out there looking at a possible story that there was rumors out there that there were these documents that would show that President Bush, when he was Lieutenant Bush in the Texas Air National Guard, was not a good service member. And CBS got their hands on these documents. There were 4 documents. And essentially what they said was that Lieutenant Bush was a pilot, that to remain a pilot, you need to take a physical every year, that he didn't take his physical and therefore lost his pilot's license. Secondly, that his evaluations were being played up because of who he was and his family. So CBS they got these documents. They started looking at them, and they decided we're going on the air with them. So Mary Mapes was the producer. She was an Emmy Award-winning producer. She had done the Abu Ghraib Iraqi prison abuses. And Dan Rather was the host of 60 Minutes, or this segment. Dan Rather was the anchor at CBS. And between Dan Rather and Mary Mapes, you had the power of CBS News. So on September 8th, they rushed this segment on the air with Dan Rather holding these documents saying President Bush was a bad Texas Air National Guardsman. Before the show even ended, the blogosphere lit up, and this is when blogs were really just starting, saying these documents are phony. For the next week, CBS defended these documents, mostly Dan Rather on the nightly news, saying, here's something else we got to defend these documents. And they even put on the next 60 Minutes a woman who was the secretary to the purported author of the documents, who said, these documents are phony, but the content is true. And Dan leans in and says, so you're saying they're true? She said, they are true. Could you repeat that again? So they're true. So another week goes by. The criticism of these documents continue. Finally, the source of the document, who is a gentleman who had been in the Texas Air National Guard with a very checkered past, changes his story on where he got the documents. This made CBS a little nervous, and they announced we're going to be doing an independent review. So this was a really big deal for CBS News. News organizations only have their credibility. Once they have a story that is really being questioned, they got to make sure they get to the bottom of this, be transparent. So Dick was retained to look at this, and what CBS said is you can talk to anybody you want. We're not going to be involved, and you give us a report on what happened here. So we did the report. We talked to many, many people at CBS, and what we found was that they just didn't have the support for the documents. CBS had said the documents had been authenticated. First of all, we knew it was impossible to authenticate a document that was a copy where the author was no longer living. And we talked to the document examiners that they had, and one said it had consistent inconsistencies. That was good enough for CBS. When we asked him, said, what do you mean? He said, well, look, I'm just a professional witness. I make a point, and then it's up to the other side to attack it. And that's one of the things they relied upon. We also talked to the woman, Marion Carr Knox, who was the secretary to the purported author. And this is the one who said, documents phony, but the content is true. So we actually went down to her house in Texas. And we said, okay, why do you say they're phony? And she took us through the various signature blocks and other things. She said, that's not how we would have done things. And I said, okay, well, let's go through the documents, 4 documents. We went through sentence by sentence. Like one was, President Bush was, or Lieutenant Bush was ordered to take a physical. Did that ever happen? She goes, no. I said, do you know of anybody else who ever was ordered to take a physical? Oh, no, we would never do anything like that. And we went sentence by sentence. And finally, got to the end, four documents, and said, okay, then why did you say the content is true? And she looked and said, I really like Dan Rather. And I thought this was terrible what was happening there. So we put out the report, and a couple of things about the report. First of all, it got a lot of media attention, as you can imagine it would. Dick made the rounds of all the other news organizations. And I remember walking through ABC News, and this was a time Peter Jennings was the anchor. And he said, hold on a second. He said, I want you to come in because your report is so critically important. We can't have news organizations that fail like this. And I've already ordered every person in my newsroom to read it, and I hope every other news organization does the same thing. Another thing, a somewhat funny footnote to this. So as we all know, Dick loved movies. Mary Mapes, who felt she was wronged here, wrote a book on this called Truth, which became a motion picture starring Robert Redford as Dan Rather. Great job as Dan Rather. Kate Blanchett as Mary Mapes. She does a great job as Mary Mapes. So who do they get to play Dick? They get a German actor who looks like he's constipated the whole time. Not a very good job. But it's an entertaining movie for at least part of it. But the bottom line is that, I think this was a critically important reminder for news organizations that do investigative journalism that when there are red flags out there, you really got to pay attention to the red flags and not put something on the air that's not ready.
So let's just abstract from those two. From that and all of your dealings with, and I love how attorneys refer to matters, all the matters that you worked on. What did you learn from my dad? And was there a Thornburgh method that you applied to these sort of situations?
Yeah, so in everything he did, we had to make sure we were right in what we did. So we really vetted the work we were doing. And he asked a lot of questions. You say this, are you sure? What about this? Where do you go? So we spent a lot of time, which I thought was a great exercise. Secondly, in these kind of reports, we wanted to be fair, had to be fair. You can't look like you're attacking someone. You have to lay it out in as fair a way as possible. Next, we had to be thorough. So the worst thing that could happen is you do a report of this magnitude and you miss something. Because anytime you're doing it, like in the CBS matter, Mary Mapes and Dan Rather were not happy. If there was a way they could attack the report, they would have done so. And to this day, that report has stood the test of time. And finally, the fourth thing is being objective. So that when we looked at it, you always have biases as you're going into something. You have to remove those biases from you and really look at things objectively.
Yeah. To the point that we discussed earlier, how do you maximize the opportunity, again, not to just lay out the facts of what happened and why things went wrong, but how do you use that to propel actions that do their best to keep this from happening again? I always used to remarked once that reports aren't self-executing.
Right.
They don't naturally, even all the recommendations you put forward, they don't naturally take hold unless they're given encouragement.
So on the CBS matter, and it's really no different than when you're in public life. You're trying to improve. In public life, you're trying to improve everybody's life. When you're doing one of these, it's more local what you're trying to do. But Dick told them, I'm not going to do this unless you agree you will adopt the recommendations we make. So at the end of the report, we had a number of recommendations, and CBS implemented each and every one, including, making sure there was another person ensuring ethics were being followed, that the processes were being followed, because they missed so many of their processes in place. And so at the end of the day, Dick helped make their investigative reporting so much stronger. And as we all know today, investigative reporting is just critical to our country, and we have to make sure, and to our democracy, and that we have to make sure it continues to be strong out there.
Just briefly, and this again harks back to the sense that Andy, this picture that he painted, that people are invited to public service. You're now the Inspector General of the Veterans Affairs.
Correct.
And I know my dad encouraged you to take that role.
Very strongly, yep.
Which is an example, this is sort of the transitive theory of leadership. You've heard that call, you've had that experience, and now, but how did he persuade you?
Well, didn't take much to persuade me. I mean, because almost every conversation, something would come up about his public service. It was so much a part of him. And I could see how proud he was of the service that he had. I could see how much he enjoyed it. But most importantly, I could see the impact that he had. And that's what he talked about, the impact. And so when I had the opportunity to go into a department that needed a lot of help, where you're dealing with veterans, which is, a population that, I believe our mission is almost noble and sacred, helping out veterans. To me, it was one of those things that, I'll never be the public servant that Dick Thornburgh was, but if I could be in his shadow somehow, then I'm going to feel great about what I'm doing.
Well, we're glad you're there.
Thanks.
Thank you. So let's just take a couple of minutes as previously. There are a couple points I want to return to, but also ask you to think about if there are illustrative stories or points that fell off the end of your remarks. But let me take moderator's privilege and point a question to John, which is one of the lessons, maybe lesson number one that Dad expressed from 3 Mile Island is that you need to expect the unexpected, which you could interpret in a number of different ways, but one of which is that when you take office, you never know what it is that you're going to be faced with. You mentioned, we all know we're in the midst of a governor's race right now. We've got other significant, we always have races for office. Do we have any, my editorial comment, it does not appear to me that in this race for governor, or that in many offices that take place, candidates aren't asked about their ability to lead in a crisis. Have you ever? So am I wrong here, or
No.
what in the world? How do we get people to acknowledge that's part of the job?
David, you're absolutely right. I actually wrote about this not too long ago in a column.
Maybe that's where I got the great idea.
And not just governing in a crisis, but governing, period. I mean, if you were new to this democracy or new to this state, you'd have no idea what was going on politically or what a governor did or who a governor is. We never tell people. I mean, nothing. You will never see a political ad that explains what it is I do. I try to make the argument that, look, you can't elect a cultural warrior to lead a state. These are the things that a governor has to do, and you can lay out all of the responsibilities. You need somebody who's actually competent. You need somebody who actually has some sense of the world and how it works. You need somebody who is willing to work for everybody, not just a block of voters. And we don't do that anymore. I mean, we don't run campaigns like that. We don't say, this is why I would make a good governor, because I've done this, I think this, I can do this, and I promise you that. And then maybe voters would actually come out to vote and have some interest and think about who they're voting for, rather than just going red, blue, boom, and vote.
Yeah. Mario Cuomo's well-traveled line that you campaign in poetry and govern
Yes,
in prose
govern in prose.
seems to be a thing of the past.
Indeed, yeah.
We govern in tweets.
Yeah, right.
Forget about poetry. That's too expressive.
Out the door. Yeah.
End of editorial comment. But as I said, I wanted to give all of you some room, either for some stories or something that one of the other panelists that sparked a thought in your.
Yeah, one thing, if I had to think of one word to describe one of Dick's greatest traits, it was humility. And I think that, you hear all the stories, and that's what you're hearing about why he was such an effective leader. So one of my favorite stories about Dick, combining baseball, of course, because everything has to come back down to baseball, is when he was growing up, as you remember, his idol was Stan Musial. He thought Stan Musial was the greatest baseball player of all time. Dick would never ask for anything. He would never ask for favors, but this involved Stan Musial. So he was going to be at the White House for an event. So Dick gets to the White House, and there's Stan Musial. And again, Dick being the humble person he is, really, he told me he really fought himself. He didn't want to go up, but he said, but there's Stan Musial. So he finally goes up and said, Mr. Musial, sir, God, you know, could I please have your autograph? And Stan Musial, of course you can. He does it. And in classic Dick fashion, he takes a look at it and goes, that's not your autograph. And Stan Musial goes, I just signed it. What do you mean that's not my autograph? He said, that's not your autograph. I'll do your autograph for you. So when Dick was a young boy with baseball cards, they would have autographs. And he memorized people's autographs. So he does Stan Musial's autograph from when he was playing, and Stan takes a look at it and says, you know, that's right, I've changed it over the years.
Well, that prompts me to tell, I have a baseball story, which was some years ago, Dad was getting an award at the Union League in Philadelphia, which, if you know that, is this storied, somewhat stuffy club, and he was talking about the rule of law, or, you know, one of his trademark themes. And I was sitting next to a buddy of mine. We came to question and answer time, and next to a buddy of mine, I poked him and I said, I'll buy you a beer if you ask him to name the starting lineup for the 1941 Chicago Cubs. And he stood up and asked him, and my dad, what? Wouldn't you know? And it wasn't even the Pirates, by the way. I mean, that would have been too easy, right? Nailed it. Starting lineup, got the whole thing. So that was brought down the house on the questions and answers. So short of baseball stories, which we could tell a lot of, any other either reflections or things that you wanted to point out, John?
I mean, listening to what was going on with Dick Thornburgh after he left Justice, it's interesting. He had this career where he's doing all these other things. He still kept doing disability rights things in this period of time. And I know because he would call me, or Ginny would call me and say, Dick really needs some help with something. But he was incredibly, you know, there's a UN treaty on the rights of people with disabilities. And we were going through a process of trying to ratify it. And Bob Dole was leading the effort. Boyd and Gray from the Bush White House was very much involved. And Dick got involved. And so he took time out from when he was doing all these other things to write speeches, to go and talk to people, do op-ed pieces for the Times and the Post, and was always there to keep the legacy going. And I think the humility part you're talking about, people don't, you know, there are a lot of people who say, I wrote the ADA is mine. Dick Thornburgh is a person who was crucial, essential to the creation of what is the ADA and its enactment. But he was never out there saying me about it. He was just a team player. And I hope this session gets people to understand how important he was to what is a very important part of American life now.
Yeah, excellent. Well, join me in thanking our panelists. I just had a couple of thoughts. First, of thanks to the great team at the Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy, notably Kim Carson, who is in back. And also Mark Nordenberg online. I'm sure you're watching, but his leadership has just been tremendous in bringing all of this together and making for this very special day. Thanks to my family, including my remarkable mother. And my brothers John and Bill and our dear brother Pete, who passed away, as many of you know, a few weeks back. It's a great family. Just a couple thoughts in closing. This is, I hope, been as fascinating and important to you as I felt. It's a great chance to celebrate and to learn. And I just wanted to add my own sort of reflection on my dad's legacy, which starts with John actually stole my headline, the notice that he was given in the Inquirer, a paper, by the way, that he didn't always see eye to eye with. But, the sense that after all these years that he's still recognized as a standard bearer in many ways, which is, I have to say, brings us immense pride for his accomplishment and impact, but there's a note of sadness there. There's a note of, where are you? Which, as a comment on our times and a challenge to all of us, just leaves us feeling like we wish he were still here and that there were many more like him. So I wanted to close with maybe what might be his advice to us. He was a great student of history. So whether it was the rise and fall of the Third Reich or Teddy Roosevelt's remarkable career or just about anything, if you see his bookshelf, he understood something of how things change or fail to change over time. So the question is, how do we do our best to change them to the point of inflection where it should be? His first piece of advice has to be the title of the book. You go where the evidence leads. That, and as John Adams says, facts are stubborn things. And the more stubborn we are about those facts, the better. A second is to remember a quote that he used often, which I pointed out to him, speaking of facts are stubborn things. Well, the quote is attributed to Edmund Burke, which is all that is necessary for evil to flourish is that a few good men do nothing. Now, I would not be his son if I didn't point out to him that there's no evidence that that quote was actually ever said or uttered by Edmund Burke, be that as it may. That's great advice. And the final thing is, and this was often his parting to us as we would leave, going off to after a dinner visit or a vacation together, he'd say, keep the faith. He'd say, keep the faith. So I think that is a great note on which to end this, that we got to keep the faith in ourselves and our democracy and to do our best to learn from his life. Thank you.